welcome to Kumi Now. My name is Marie Claire, and I'm hosting this from Tantor Ecumenical Institute in Jerusalem today. So it's such a pleasure to be with all of you. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we talk about education funding and policy. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that our webinar is being broadcast live on Facebook and will be posted to YouTube. If you want to make sure your photo does not appear online, please turn off your camera. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being put in the chat so that others may join. As usual, if you have an idea or project that you would like to share with us, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. Now it's time for our weekly activism survey. We will now launch the poll. Please note that there are 3 questions, so scroll down for the third. We're now going to give you a couple of minutes to look at the poll and answer the questions, and then we'll come back together and go over the answers. Okay, we're going to give you a few more seconds to put in your final answers. You can feel free to take guess. Okay, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to go over the answers for us together. So the answer to question number 2, which organization runs 711 schools serving Palestinian children, is the final choice, UNRWA. And the answer to number 3 about a primary factor leading to high dropout rates in East Jerusalem is the third choice, a shortage of classrooms. We hope that you will find this session interesting and informative. And I'd like to start by having everyone you see introduce themselves, which actually today Omar is sick. So normally at this point, those of you who join us every week, we do an update from the ground and Omar shares some of that with us. So we're just going to move in directly to our main issue of the day, which is education and funding policy. We're very fortunate today to have a very special guest with us, Boutros Mansour, the director of Nazareth Baptist School. As Mr. Mansour speaks, if you think of any questions, please type them into the chat and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible when we turn to the question and answer question. So Mr. Mansour, please go ahead, introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay, great. Good evening. It's evening around here. I don't know what's happening over there, probably the morning for most of you. I'm happy to be with you and to share with you on this important topic of education and funding and so on. Of course, this is a very large subject and it'll be hard to tackle it in a short time, but at least I'll try to give basic information and we can go forward from there. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll try to share it now. Okay, you can see it? I suppose so. Okay. This is a little bit of information about myself. I'm a lawyer in my profession. I studied at the Hebrew University. I became a lawyer in 1993. I worked as a lawyer for some time and then I became the general director of Nazareth Baptist School, which is a K-12 school. Actually, Reverend Naim Ati graduated from this school and worked in it as a teacher as well. We have about 1,000 students. It's in downtown Nazareth. That's in Israel proper. Of course, this is not the West Bank, but it's in Israel proper. Started by the Southern Baptists something like 80 years ago, but today run by a local organization. I'm also a writer. I serve, this is my 4th year as the chairman of the Convention of Evangelical Churches in Israel. And for some time, I was the member of the executive committee for church school secretariat, which includes Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox schools. I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. Okay, these are books that I wrote. The one on the left, Looking from the Precipice, is a book that was published by Paraclete Press in March of this year. When My Neighbor is a Savior was published about 10 years ago from Hope Publishing House in California. And these are another two books in Arabic. Okay, I'll jump directly. I'm not going to give an introduction about schools in Israel, or about information about the population in Israel and so on, but I'll jump in directly to education. Arab Palestinian children in Israel use three types of schools: the public educational system, government schools, regular government schools, with special features for the Arab community, but they are public run. The teachers, the principals are appointed by the Minister of Education and so on, and fully funded from the government. And then there is the church school system, which we as Baptist School are part of. And we are very much like charter schools in America, where we get partial funding from the government as well as tuition. And then there are schools that are run privately by private organizations, and their number in the Arab community is very small because it's very costly to run a school without any type of funding or support from the government. The number of students in Israel out of the 9 million people living in Israel is 2.2 million people. Out of that, there are about 20%, almost the same number, the same percentage as our percentage in the Israeli society. The Palestinian population is 21% of the whole population of Israel, and with the students, it's 20%. Church schools, on the other hand, are 1.5% of the whole student population in Israel. And if you take that from the Arab students in Israel, then it's 7.5%, 33,000 students. The church schools are not schools that have only Christian students, but they are mixed, with about 60% of them, about 19,000 Christian students from all denominations, as well as 14,000 Muslim students in all these church schools around the country. The church schools were established hundreds of years ago, way before Israel was established. For example, the Terasanta Roman Catholic school here in Nazareth was established 400 years ago. Our school is relatively new, and it was established, as I said, by the Southern Baptists from America about 80 years ago. And the principle that each church wanted to have some kind of agency, station, church, school, hospital, university, even in the Holy Land. It's very attractive for a church in America to have, something in Jerusalem, something in Bethlehem, in Nazareth, these places that are very important for our Christian faith. So they started all these schools. And the principle in the Catholic schools was that we will have a school. The school will be just beside a church or a monastery. Okay, what we have today are 37 schools in the country, Christian schools, I mean, church, we call them church schools. 30 of them are Catholic, different types. Roman Catholic are the majority, the mainline Roman Catholic Church, the big church. Greek Melkite Catholic, of course, like you mentioned Father Shakur, he was the Archbishop of the Melkite Catholic Church, which is an Eastern type of Catholic Church, established 200 years ago with Orthodox liturgy, sort of, more type of liturgy, but it's part of Rome, it's part of Catholicism. And then there are schools that are run by covenants, mainly Roman Catholic, but they are independent in themselves. St. Joseph School, the Salesian School, and so on. So the number is 30. Then there are the non-Catholic, and there are 3 Greek Orthodox, 2 Anglican schools, 1 Baptist, our school, and then 1 Church of Scotland school in Jaffa and Tel Aviv. If you ask anybody here in our country, what is the main feature of these schools, they will tell you that if they want to be negative, they will say, oh, these are selective schools, which is not true, but I'll not enter into that. But they will say these are very high achievement, and these are schools that are for the elite, sort of, very high achievement, and for people who have money. Because we pay tuition. Of course, tuition is not high. In American standards, it's peanuts. It's funny even. An annual tuition for a student in primary school, in a church school, and that's the average. And all the schools are sort of very close one to another, and the tuition that they take is about $1,500 a year. So that's relatively small. In this country, of course, it's a little bit different. Some families are poor families. So if you have 3 kids and you have to pay $4,500 a year, and then add to it books and trips and uniform and so on, that will be quite difficult for them. However, we are known for high achievements. Just a little bit of information. The entitlement of a Bagrut certificate, the percentage of graduates who are entitled to a full Bagrut. Bagrut is the government exam, the Israeli standard government exam. In Israel, the percentage is 65% of the graduates of a certain year will be entitled to a full Bagrut certificate. In the Christian schools, it's 81%. Now, excellence in Bagrut exams is these are the highest 7%. There are certain criteria in the Ministry of Education when a graduate is considered to be an excellent one. You will need to achieve, you will need to have intensive English, intensive math, very high marks in them, and those are 7%. In our schools, in the church schools, we are more than double. We are 15% of our graduates are considered excellent graduates. I can tell you in our school, the average of excellent graduates is about 30%. Last year, we had about close to 40% of our graduates were considered excellent graduates in standards of the whole country. Okay, this is Hebrew. Sorry, you cannot read Hebrew, but I put arrows where this is the list of the schools that have the highest percentage of excellent graduates in a certain year. It's a little bit old. This one is 2009, but because they had it in Haaretz, the national newspaper, it was nice. And because our school was in number 4, Baptist school, with 31% of the graduates in that year were considered excellent. So, and I put arrows near the other Christian schools, the Orthodox school in Haifa, St. Joseph nuns, and then St. Joseph, the other one. 2 St. Joseph were in this list of the first 12, 13 schools all around the country. This is a national statistics that were given here. Okay, more information. Sorry, it's in Arabic, but 95% of St. Joseph were considered excellent. In our school, it was 96. And so on and so on. Anyway, let's go forward. Why are the Christian community is the most educated segment of Israeli society, even higher than the Jewish community. Of course, the Jewish community is 6.5 million people, and the Arab Christian, Palestinian Christian community in Israel is 135,000. Huge difference, but in general, in average, the Christian segment in society is the most educated. It's higher than the Jewish. Of course, the Jewish, you will find the Ashkenazi, the Western Jews who came from Europe are very, very educated. But on the other hand, you will find the ultra-Orthodox who are not that educated. So in general, and as an average, the Christian community is even more educated than the Jewish one. And what are the reasons for this excellence of the Christian community as a whole, and of course reflected in the Christian schools? Quickly, first of all, as I said, these schools were established hundreds of years ago, in a time when Palestine was under the Ottoman, the Turkish rule, which was a backward type of rule, very oppressing, did not care about the people. These Catholic and Protestant churches came Palestine because it's the Holy Land and established schools that benefited the local Christian community at first, as well as the Muslim community in the second stage. But it was mainly for the Christian, local, indigenous Christian community. So that gave sort of an advantage for the Palestinian Christians. And we're trying to keep that advantage, not as a race, with anybody else, but when you are good, you want to continue and be better and better. And as a result, I think that gave us an advantage on the rest of the community. And of course, as the Palestinian Christians are a minority in a minority, we are Palestinians, but we are a minority among the Muslims. And we are also Arab Palestinians, and we are a minority among Israel, among the Jews. So like the Jews themselves, all around the world, in America, all the Jews are about 6 million people, but they are in all the influential places, in media, in universities, and so on. I think the same pattern is with Palestinian Christians, because we are a minority. A very high number of people continue and do their higher education. I can tell you about my family. I have a master's. My wife has 2 masters. She's more educated than me. My son is a medical doctor, and my daughter, she's a Rhodes Scholar. Thank God for that. I don't need to pay anything. She's fully funded, and she studies in Oxford University. She finished her master's, and she'll be starting PhD in England. Of course, they don't call it PhD. They call it, I don't know what they call it. It's British. Anyway, but it's the third, she'll be a doctor in whatever she's studying. So, and the youngest one just finished high school. So just to give you a taste of, we value very much education, and we want our children to be educated because that's a passport. Unfortunately, we live in an area that has lots of tensions. We don't want our kids to leave and go live somewhere else, but we want to give them the guarantee, and they need to be better than others in order to be steadfast and live here with a calling in Israel/Palestine. Okay, thirdly, of course, the openness that comes with this influence from the West. The liberal West, liberal in a good way, influences the schools, influences our people here. This unfortunately leads also to immigration, but the affiliation with the West gives us the opportunity to be a lot of our people are very open. They want to study. They will travel abroad in order to study, and so on. According to a Christianity Today poll from a few years ago, they did a comparison between American Christians and Arab Palestinian Christians in Israel, or actually in the whole Holy Land, including West Bank and Palestine. They found that the Christians are less religious than other segments in society. But even in that case, religion or the church has not been a restraining factor. It did not stop people from asking to be more educated, fortunately. Unfortunately, sometimes the church had been pulling people back, but I think the church in general in the Holy Land has been an encouraging factor for more education. And another feature is that the Arab Christian intelligence intelligentsia in the Middle East is a product of church schools. Lots of thinkers, philosophers, politicians, journalists, writers, and so on got their education in church schools. This, of course, is a reason that the Israeli government not always favors our schools and looks a little bit cautiously on our schools and does not want that to continue, but it is there. Okay, a few features and the dynamics of church schools, like my school and the other 37 schools that I mentioned before. Of course, we're an Arab school, we're a Palestinian school in a Jewish country. This is a picture, that's me with a tie, not like today. And this is Naftali Bennett, currently the Prime Minister of Israel. This was in 2015, there was a crisis for the Christian schools and we went on strike for almost a month. I don't know if you remember that. And we met in the president's office at the time, Ovein Rivlin. He tried to bring a compromise. He tried to bring both parties and try to help reach a settlement, and he did not succeed. Anyway, we always have the fact that we are Arab, Palestinian, in a Jewish country. We always have that as in the background. We have that in the background. The conflict influences our school, we want it or not. Then on the other hand, we are part of a special section in the Ministry of Education called Recognized Schools, but not public schools. And we suffer from partial funding. And in 2015, as I mentioned, the big strike happened because they were cutting more and more, even in the small and the partial funding that they were giving, especially for the primary school. And it reached the very low percentage of 29%. And the parents were supposed to fund the rest, the 71% left of the schools. But then they put a ceiling. They said, even if you can subsidize and pay this 71% of what you have, what you need, but we will put a ceiling and we will not allow you to pay more. So they put us in an impossible situation. Okay, as I mentioned, sought out schools because of high academics, and we are part of the general Arab system that suffers from inequality. These are special features of this inequality, and I'll try to finish with that. Of course, the infrastructure of our schools, in general, I'm talking not just the Christian schools. Christian schools were built and maintained for all these years by the churches that poured in millions of dollars in order to build them. And you would expect that because they saved the government the funding needed to build these schools, that they will be more supportive, but they were not. The infrastructure in general in all the Arab public schools was very bad. It's changing to the better because of pressure that Israel has from the OECD of hiring the level of education in Israel and the numbers getting them better. However, the infrastructure is still lacking. Our curriculum, we need, in order to get funding from the government, we need to teach according to the Israeli curriculum. When we talk about history or civics and so on, there is an absence of any Palestinian narrative. That's a problem. And this is my last slide. It is taken from an Israeli newspaper. Unfortunately, it's in Hebrew, but it talks about the funding that each section of schools in Israel. And it shows that in high school, the public Arab schools get 26,000 shekel a year per student, but the religious Jew get 43,000, 26 compared to 43,000. The ultra-Orthodox up here 24,000, but the ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews, they don't teach all the subjects. They don't want to study English. They don't want to study math. They just want to study the Torah. So this is why they're lower even than the Arabs. And then there is the public Jewish school, 32,000. So you see the difference. Although the Arab Palestinian community is weaker, poorer than the rest of segments, it is very low. Here they're showing the increase. The increase is from 2015, went up 36%, but still there's a big gap. And you see the same thing also in primary school. Church schools get 40% of that for the primary, from the primary of what the public school gets. As I said, it was 29% a few years ago. They raised it up. We get now about 40% of what is given at the primary school. And the difference is paid by the parents. And we have difficulties every year. We're still having difficulty on this issue. Okay, I'll stop here and give you a chance to think about what I shared. And if you have questions, of course, you are more than welcome to ask them after Ryan or Marie Claire moves us to the coming stage. Thank you.
Much for your very helpful and informative talk. Before we move on to questions, we'd like to introduce our action for the day and give everyone a few minutes to get started on it. So today, we'd like to help publicize the funding discrimination that faces Palestinian students. As you can see on the slide, which will be displayed shortly, what you will see on the slide is that we'd like to bring awareness to the severe funding discrimination that affects schools for Palestinian students, particularly schools for Palestinian children in Israel, which receive only a fraction of the funding of schools in other parts of Israel on a per student basis. So here's the action that you can see on the screen. So we have a couple of different options here. The first is to take a photo of your school or a shelf of books in your library and use a marker or Photoshop to black out about half of the school books and share it with the text. We'd miss this much of our education if our school was a Palestinian school in Israel, and post it in your school hall or library. Or you could think about sending a book about justice, such as Blood Brothers, to the Ministry of Education and suggest in a note in the cover, since you find it difficult to do the right thing and fund Palestinian schools properly, I thought you should read this book. You can then add it to the school library somewhere in Israel as it is needed. So these are some of our suggestions. We also have, you could take your school library photos of this action and post them on social media and include links to Kumi Now, today's session, so other people can view it. So these are some of our suggestions. Mr. Mansour, is there anything else you'd like to say about our action time today and what people can do to bring attention to and fix the discriminatory funding and policies that affect the education of Palestinian children?
What you're doing is raising awareness, by these podcasts and this talks. So thank you for doing that. I think by raising awareness, God can, guide each one which way according to where they live and so on, and talk to, if we have a crisis here, then you'll be ready and you'll be aware of what's happening. Talking to a congressman and talking to the Israeli, to the American government and so on will always help. If you come and visit Israel, please, or Palestine, for both, please come and visit one of the schools, and that will be a big encouragement, as well as churches, of course. Visit the Living Stones as well.
Thank you so much. We're now going to get to work. The instructions are on the screen. Please note that Zoom does not allow on-screen links. Everything you need is being shared in the chat. We're going to give you about 5 minutes to get started figuring out what you're going to read or watch and how you can share it on social media. So we're going to start that now, and then we'll come back together and we'll have a time of questions together. Great. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be back with all of you. Thanks for all the actions that you've started. We're now going to move on to our question and answer period. So I'm going to jump right into it. The first question I have is, how do joint schools fit into the system that you outlined for us today? So the example in this question is the hand-in-hand initiative.
Yes, I am aware of Yad Biyad, the joint schools. I think they are also recognized, but not public schools, so they also have the tuition. We don't have them in Nazareth, so I don't know. I think they have one in Haifa, and of course in Jerusalem, the famous school around there. They're doing fine, I think, like all other schools. I don't think they do have a funding problem because of the presence of Jewish students in them as well. I can't say more. I'm not an expert on them.
Thank you. Our next question is, what happened in East Jerusalem this week with the arrest of a school principal?
Not hear about it, sorry.
Okay, yes, no problem, no problem.
This is a too interesting country, so lots of things happening.
True. It's true. There's lots of things happening. What you covered today in terms of the breakdown of various types of schools, does this apply to primary schools, secondary schools, or both?
Both.
Both. Okay, thank you. In what language are classes taught? Could a Jewish Israeli, perhaps an immigrant from a Western country, attend a church school?
In Nazareth, church schools as well as public schools, they teach in Arabic. Arabic is our mother language, and everything is taught in Arabic. Now, in our school, because it was started by Americans, we had English from the first grade as well. Arabic intensive, 11 hours a week for a kid, 6-year-old, first grader with Arabic, as well as English, 3 hours a week. Recently, I think 4 or 5 years ago, Naftali Bennett, the current prime minister, decided that he wants to enhance the teaching of Hebrew. Hebrew used to be from the 3rd grade, and now it's also from the 1st grade. So these poor kids, 6-year-old kids, have Arabic, English, and Hebrew from the 1st grade. So they were playing, in kindergarten, and then a year after, they're already studying 3 languages. So, yeah. Now, Israel has a system of sort of a segregation, and the language issue is very important. In the past, there were few individual Jewish students who studied in Nazareth Baptist School, but the teaching was done in English at that time. Today, because it's done in Arabic, theoretically, if a Jewish student wants to study in our school, he'll be most welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan, as we say in Arabic. But this does not happen because of the language barrier. So Jews study alone, Arabs study alone. Yad Biyad, the joint school, is an exception, a lovely exception. But mostly 98%, if not 99% of schools are either Arab or Jewish.
Thank you. What happens with education in Ramallah and in areas under the Palestinian Authority?
Of course, this is a different system entirely, and we are not related to that one over there. Of course, we are Palestinians, they are Palestinians, but they are under the Palestinian Authority and under Israeli occupation. Here, we are in Israel, or as someone said here, they want me to say 48, fine, 48, okay, but we are full Israeli citizens. While over there, they are they are residents of the Palestinian Authority, under the Palestinian Authority, and under occupation. So I'm not an expert about what happens there. I know, of course, that the Palestinians everywhere are very eager to study. Just a very nice news we had yesterday that in Najah University in Nablus, in Shechem, the, the recent Times ranking of universities around the world put in Najah for the first time in the first 500 universities in the world. So that's, that's even before Haifa University here in Israel and so on. And for the first time, that's for people who are under occupation. So our people try to study more, but of course the reality of being under occupation where you are deprived of even traveling and even, it's in all areas of life that's difficult. I'm not an expert about specifically what happens in Ramallah, but I think it's okay, it's fine. It's not okay, but it's going forward. It's not the worst in the world, of course, as I said.
Thank you. Is there a difference between the number of boys and girls being educated, or is it pretty much the same?
In schools, the numbers are almost 50-50. In universities, and that's recent, and that's something I'm very proud of, the number of girls studying in universities is much higher, much higher. The women who are doing PhDs is enormous, more than men. So I'm happy for that, and that's a good sign of the society going forward. The Bedouin community is, poor people. They live in unrecognized villages and towns in the south. Israel has decided not to recognize them, and they do not have running water in some places, and some places do not have electricity. But we had our first professor, lady from the Bedouin community, just a few weeks ago. So I'm very proud of what the Palestinians are doing in education, and women especially. I tell you, I know of in our community around here of people who are in our children's age who are doing very well and doing PhDs and everywhere in England and in France and in Germany and in Tel Aviv University and America, you name it. From our school, we have someone in Princeton, someone in Yale. She just finished her first degree. And we have someone in Columbia University doing a PhD, just from our school I'm talking. And this is not, we have 70, 75 students who graduate every year, not huge numbers. And still we have these numbers. We had 6 who were admitted to the Bar Association just 2 weeks ago from our school. So yeah, I'm very proud of it, despite all the difficulties and the lack of funding and so on. They are doing a great job.
Wow, thank you for sharing that. That's really exciting to hear. The next question is, how do schools deal with issues in the curriculum that give negative views of Palestinians?
This is what we call wisdom, look the other way and say something else off the record or outside. Yeah, it's you have to find ways around that, and not to teach it as something that's and to be fair, I think the Minister of Education knows that, so sometimes these parts will be selective. I know, for example, in history, I think the part about the establishment of the state of Israel is a selective part. So a lot of Arab schools just don't take that, and of course they lose one area, and they need to concentrate on the other areas because it's selective in the curriculum. But this is the way to go around it.
Thank you. Are church schools only located mainly in major cities in Palestine, or are they also in rural areas?
They are all around. Nazareth, you will have a big number. We have 7 here, 7 or 8 in Nazareth. Haifa has a large number, but you will find in Raini, small village near Nazareth, Cana of Galilee, Ailabun, small village. No, it's not just in the main areas, but you will have them. Of course, not in every village and town, but in a large number of them. And Ailabun has a school. So Mghar, which is a village near it, some of the students from Mghar who prefer that will attend the school in Ailabun. So, and the distances are not huge, so they can go from one place to another.
Thank you. Do schools receive any financial help from the relevant church denominations? From church denominations. So for example, if the school is Catholic, do they receive funding from the Catholic Church, Orthodox from the Orthodox Church? And is that money inside or also from foreigners donating?
They, of course, were started by the churches in the West. If it's Catholic, if it's a Covenant, if it's Baptist, if it's Anglican, they were started there. Today, they get most of the funding, locally from the government here, as well as tuition. And the mother church, if you want to call it, the churches abroad that started these schools, in a lot of cases continue to support for development and keeping the property. Of course, the needs around the world are huge. I heard that from some of my colleagues in the Catholic churches. They said, you go to Rome to tell them, you need money to help you in your school, but at the same time, there's a huge tragedy in Syria. And so you want me to give you money, they prefer to give it where there is the larger need. But still, of course, there is this, each one of the schools has its relationships, and they help mostly in development of the school from facilities and new labs, and new library, and so
on. Do West Bank Palestinians take the Bagrat, the Israel's high school matriculation exam to enable them to be employed in Israel?
No, they have an exam called Tawjihi. This is the same system like in Jordan. So it's a special exam. It's equivalent, I think, to the Bagrut. And the results were released just 3 weeks ago, and people were shooting in the air, because they were so happy about it in Ramallah and Bethlehem. Shooting has different reasons, different feel to it over there, but this is how they celebrate it. Anyway, it's equivalent, and the Ministry of Education of the Palestinian Authority are the ones that regulate that and do it. But and this year, I don't know if this is because of the COVID thing, but the results were higher than regular in the Palestinian Authority. Maybe they made them the exams a little bit easier for the kids who were studying via Zoom, online, and that's so difficult. So but it's called Tawjih.
Thank you. There's one question that's asking for clarification about something you said in your presentation. Does the Israeli government fund 40% of the church school tuition and parents pay the rest? Okay, and then do the churches pay expenses as well?
Expenses for what?
For the tuition. I think it's related to the question from earlier. So sometimes church denominations would also help with the funding.
Let's distinguish the problems that we have are in primary school. In high school, we get almost full funding, a little bit less than full funding in high school. But in primary school, which is grades 1 to 8, that's 2/3 of the whole school, we get this percentage of 40%. So because most of our schools are, go all the way like our school, kindergarten up to 12th grade, where we start with the kid when he's 4-year-old, or some schools 3 years old, and it continues until, he finishes high school. So you have the opportunity. That's part of our philosophy. You teach the kid when he's still young, and you give the values, the Christian values, and so on, until he finishes. But as a result, 2/3 of the school are they get the funding, the 40%. When you put it together, what you get in the high school, which is high, good percentage, almost 100%, then we do the calculation, and we charge someone who has a kid in the 5th grade, not the 60%, the whole 60%, maybe another 40%. And then in high school, we do charge in order to keep it balanced, sort of. And So that's the situation, yes. And as I said, the churches abroad, they do not fund for operation or for tuition. Maybe sometimes you'll find a church that will give you, 4 scholarships for kids who have difficulties and so on. And none of the Christian schools I know sack or dismiss kids who do not pay. Their parents are not able to pay. We give a lot of discounts and lots of scholarships from our own money as a school. We take that into consideration because at the end of the day, it's a Christian message. We did not come for the rich or for the more affluent people and so on. So that's also important to note, that all the Christian schools try to help and not have anybody prevented from attending or even for a trip. I've had teachers here tell me, there's this kid, he has a difficulty in paying for the trip we're having. Can you help? Of course, we can help. We always help. So yeah, thank God for that.
Thank you. Are girls and boys in separate schools in some instances, or are the schools mixed?
Today, I am not aware of any who's still separate. When I was a kid, when I was in high school, our school was the only one. I think it was the only one that was mixed. Today, all the schools, the Catholic schools, most of them are Catholic, this is why I mentioned them, are mixed schools, yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and for everyone else who was able to join us on our call. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in the next day or so. And it will also be shared in our next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter to make sure you receive them. We would greatly appreciate it if you shared this amazing session with your friends and colleagues, as well as the information on our future sessions. Next week, we will focus on Bethlehem and the ways that Israeli occupation and apartheid wall encircle Bethlehem and Rachel's tomb, cutting them off from each other and the rest of Palestine. If you'd like to be reminded of the online gatherings an hour before you begin, you can register for an email reminder at kuminow.com/online using the form at the bottom of this page. Thank you again, Mr. Mansour, for your talk and for sharing your time with us. It was very informative and we're very grateful. To everyone else, we really hope to see you back here next week. Thanks again and have a good evening.
God bless you all. Thank you.